Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to an outstanding webinar entitled Trust in AI, Rethinking Future Command, written by and delivered by two experts in the field, Christina Balis of QinetiQ and Paul O'Neill of the Royal United Services Institute. My name is Hugh Morris. I'm a senior research partner at Zien, and it's my pleasure to chair the event today. And I can only do so thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, finance, social matters. Now, my job is to get out of the way as soon as possible and hand over to our speakers. Some housekeeping notes. Slides are available to download in the chat and on the website. We'll be holding about a 20-minute Q&A session after the presentation by Christina and Paul. Please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions into me, which I will then feed into the conversation. So, without further ado, Christina and Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I guess before we start, we probably should manage expectations. There are two big words on this slide, trust and AI. And Paul and I probably can say with some confidence that we are experts in neither. Hopefully any questions about the philosophical concept of trust or any really complex technical questions about AI, we're probably not the right people. But what we hope we can engage with you today is a broader discussion about how we should think about trust in AI, particularly in the context of future military command, and focus on some of the topics that tend not to get enough attention, particularly outside the narrow area of technology. A bit of background about how this paper came about. It started with some early work that we did within QinetiQ more than a year ago, exploring the concept of trust. We knew that it was fundamental to anything we do in relation to defense capability, not just in terms of relationships between teams, but relationship between private sector and public sector, relationship between societies and the military. And that work led us to this topic, which was how should we be thinking about AI? So not just autonomy, but AI in the concept of trust, and particularly military decision-making. We're fortunate to have quite a lot of experts, both within and outside the military, academic, and private sector, to inform this paper. We're very fortunate that Michael Minelli was also interviewed for this paper, which also made the connection to this webinar. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So trust. I probably don't need to elaborate why trust is important. It's a fundamental concept in everything we do. We see it around us, and interestingly enough, it is also a concept that is widely adopted in the field of technology, and it's seen as a fundamental precondition for public acceptance of any kind of technology. When we say I don't trust this technology, what we mean is usually we don't trust how the technology has been designed or how it has been programmed. It's not as simple with AI. AI forces us to rethink the meaning of trust in very fundamental ways. We say, for example, that AI must be trustworthy or explainable. And these are concepts that we have not used with previous technologies or even also significant innovations. So how should we be thinking about the AI-human relationship? If trust describes a relationship between two agents, and in this case, one of the agents is not human, what role the human should have in this equation? And how do we approach concepts such as morality or integrity, which again have been traditional components of our understanding of trust? So most people, when they refer to trust, they think of a relationship, as I mentioned, between two agents, and there is a belief in two aspects of trust. One is competency, and the other one is the motive of the trustee, the person that the trustor trusts. The problem here when we talk about AI is we can't really, at this stage of AI development, talk about a motive. We can't really talk about integrity or some values that underpin the agent. And therefore, we need to think beyond the traditional understanding of trust. And one of the definitions that we've adopted, and in fact, it's a definition used for other technologies, but it's also, interestingly enough, a definition that is very close to one that OECD usually recently used in a cross-national trust study. And that view sees trust as being an expectation of a positive behavior. Now, there might be some values involved in this, but it's not necessarily imputing a motive on the part of the AI. And that's the one that we've used to approach this analysis. One final comment to make here that I think remains common across all the definitions of trust is there is a sense of vulnerability. A trust that can be broken is not trust. So even when we trust AI, we do expose ourselves. There is a significant risk involved in us trusting whatever we do with that particular technology. And I'm sure we can come back to this. The other point is that when we talk about an expectation of a positive behavior, what kind of behavior are we referring to? Is it, for example, that I trust the AI to behave in a predictable way? Or is it that I trust the AI to deliver the right answer? These are, again, very fundamental questions. We'll come back to this. Now, the use of AI in the military is accelerating, and we should expect AI to become prominent across all different functions, both what we would refer to as back office as well as frontline functions. In this paper, we have consciously chose to focus on the role of AI in and for military decision-making, and on the function of command in particular. And there are three main reasons why we made that choice. One is this is a fairly nascent field. It's not as explored as other areas of military uses of AI. Secondly, challenges our understanding of human agency in ways that other uses of AI do not. And thirdly, it is our belief that it will, over time, fundamentally transform how militaries are organized, manned, and directed. And that's the reason why future command and the focus on that is so important. I should also probably add that we have shied away from any detailed discussion about the ethical uses of AI, not because it's not important, but because it is a very prominent topic, and many others have thoroughly already analyzed and addressed this. We acknowledge the importance of ethics, particularly when we talk about one of the 5 trust points that we will refer to shortly, particularly the deployment trust. But we want to put the emphasis on aspects of trust that we believe do not get as much attention as they should. So before we go further into some of those trust points, it might be worthwhile clarifying what is different when we talk about the use of AI in military decision-making compared to other cases. And there are 2 parallels that are made, that are often made. One is to other civilian uses of the military, and for those who are active in the finance world, you know that AI is fundamental to everything that is done in modern finance today. And in fact, a lot of critical decisions are made. So what is different between that application and what we're talking about here? And the second one is the parallel to the use of autonomy. And again, when we talk about lethal autonomous systems, often we conflate autonomy and AI. Very briefly to address the first one, there are 3 reasons why the use of AI for military, and particularly military decision-making, is fundamentally different to anything we can think of in the civilian world. The first one is the episodic nature of conflict. Unfortunately, in the military, we don't have the abundance of data that we have in the civilian world, and that's because the opportunities to train data on real-time situations are far fewer than you have in the civilian world, where essentially you train data in milliseconds and thousands of decisions are made constantly. So one is obviously the absence of data. The second one is the complexity of the environment, what Clausewitz referred to as the fog of war. We still have no other environment other than the military environment where we have such a confluence of factors and dynamics that really drive a very complex environment. And the third one is, of course, the implication of human life. And this is why the bar for the use of AI in military will always be higher than any other technology, because the implications for safety and human life are so significant. Now, very briefly on autonomy and AI, there are differences both in terms of the end goal and the means. Autonomy is about completing a pre-programmed task. AI is really about solving problems. And while autonomy is enabled by AI, not all of uses of AI are autonomous. In fact, many applications of AI are used to complement and augment human decision-making rather than replace it. And arguably, that's why it is so tricky, because we need to make a human call ultimately as to what we trust in the AI and how we're going to best use it. So the paper, I'll conclude here and pass on to Paul to offer some additional comments, but the paper puts forward a framework of trust that is built on 5 trust points, and they're listed there. There's the deployment or use, which to some extent covers also the ethical dimension. So what's the use to which the AI is being put. The next 3, data or inputs, process and outputs, are probably the 3 areas that get most of the attention when people talk about trust in AI. And these are really a question of technology. They really talk to aspects of the technology and how we can improve it, how can we make it more explainable, how can we make it more trustworthy. Where we want to put more emphasis on is on the 5th trust point, which we call the ecosystem. And that fundamentally goes well beyond questions of technology. I'll conclude here with one quote that we also use in the paper, and in some ways, I think summarizes very neatly the broader challenge that we face here. And it's a quote that was made more than a decade ago by a leading sociobiologist, E.O. Wilson, who said that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And unfortunately, most of the public attention right now is on the advantages and risks of the technology. Much less is being said or done about the implications for our human cognitive constructs and our institutions. And this is really where we believe we as society and with our militaries, we need to pay more attention to. Paul, over to you. What did I leave out?
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Hugh, and very nice to be here today. I don't think you left anything out, Christina, and it was really helpful that you brought us onto that point about the organization and the people implications, because too often the debate, in our view, has focused on the technology. It's been held within a narrow group of people who are often, and forgive me if it applies to any of you, but are often zealots or passionate about it. And what we're seeing now is the diffusion of this connectivity with the technology into organizations, touching people whom ordinarily may not have expected to be impacted by that. So what I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing, and there is a reason why that picture is on the slide, it's not just to make it difficult to read the bullet points, but I'll come back to that in a moment, is really talk about some of the organizational and people implications of introduction of artificial intelligence into decision support within the military context. And it's all very much, as Christina alluded to, about this adapting the ecosystem to the technology as well as the technology to the ecosystem. So it's got to be more than just digitizing the analog processes. So I think in terms of the organization of the armed forces, if we're brutally honest, then the armed forces of today remain recognizable to Napoleon, or indeed to Robert E. Lee or to General Grant or others, in terms of size, in terms of structures, in terms of composition. So the idea of the division, which is one of the military formations, is because Napoleon decided he wanted to divide his army into more manageable chunks. And so a division of that became called a division. Nothing if not logical, I suppose. But the reality is technology is changing what military commanders can see. They can see more, they can understand more, and they can affect more. But they haven't necessarily changed the military structures. Now, this predates in some respects AI, but AI, I think, acts as an accelerant to this. I should say as well, I'm not sure necessarily this means for the military that things will necessarily inevitably get smaller. And although our paper focuses principally on decision support, if you think about the autonomy, the remote systems, things like swarming drones, things like remotely piloted vehicles, are actually all very people intensive. So unlike Osborne and Fry, who came out very early on with this idea that 75% of jobs are going to be made redundant as a result of the introduction of AI, which they have recalibrated. As it's very easy at the start of a new technology to see what's going to change, but it's not easy to see what new things are going to be created. So that assessment has reduced over time. We think there's a fundamental role for people working with AI to leverage the benefits of both. So within the headquarters element and what the military call command and control, which is what C2 stands for. They do actually go up to C5 if you're interested, but that becomes far too complicated. And so I think we'll just stick at command and control. Then typically military command and control structures are fairly monolithic, that it almost doesn't matter what kind of operation you're engaged with, but the military command and control headquarters will look remarkably similar. They're different across the different domains. So if you're maritime, land or air, they do look different, of course, but within those domains, they do look remarkably similar. They're often large, and they're often large in terms of emitting radio waves. They would be easily identifiable, and as we've seen in Ukraine at the moment, something that gives out an awful lot of electronic energy becomes easily targetable. And they tend to be relatively immobile. And we think that's going to change in the future. They're going to become more bespoke, and AI enables this. AI is less wedded to the idea of the way things have always been done than people. And there's an interesting story from a friend of mine who went to look at the Mini factory in Cowley. And he said what they were doing there was people did the routine stuff, but when they needed to do bespoke pieces, they got the machine to do it because it was easier to program the machine to change than it was to program a person to change, which is almost counterintuitive. But AI provides the opportunity of going against historic means of organizing, because it doesn't matter if it's done differently in a different way. So we think it will be more bespoke, and various exercises, including Joint Protector, which was run a few years ago, have highlighted some of these changes. It's probably going to be much more fed like a newsroom, whereas traditionally the commander, the kingfisher, who would be the point at which all information would come together, would be focused, and various layers of the headquarters in very hierarchical structure would filter things out and feed that through. And commanders would have what the military would call CCIRs, Commanders Critical Information Requirements, or RFIs, Requests for Information. And that would be fed into the system, which would then go and generate the answers and then feed back a response. AI allows a more push-based system, very much like the 24-hour newsroom, and that needs to change how the headquarters are structured, how their processes work. And we think it provides an opportunity to be far more adaptive. So you can go through things like the military air tasking order, which is the thing that works out where you're going to put your aeroplanes over what period of space and time in around about a 48-hour cycle. But you can be far more adaptive with AI in speeding that kind of process up. And this, we think, gives rise to the potential to reduce the size of headquarters, which makes them more survivable and more mobile. But we think there's an interesting dichotomy here, because one of the later bullet points is how do you train your leaders? And because of the episodic nature of battle, as Christina's already alluded to, what you don't want to do is have a very thin organization going to war, because it becomes almost a training ground for others to experience working in that environment. And also, of course, it provides resilience by having a slightly larger organization, because the enemy wants to kill you, literally and indeed in soft terms by overwhelming you with information as well. So a much more bespoke kind of headquarters structure that will differentiate perhaps the type of operations. A UN peacekeeping mission, for example, may have a very different command and control structure to one that might be recognizable in what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, where you have quite classic state-on-state military conflict. Counterinsurgencies in themselves may be different. And AI, if you couple it with simulation and the opportunity to experience in the virtual domain some of these ideas, then you can become far more adaptive, and you can become a better organization, sorry, better able to respond to the specific mission that you're facing. The other thing AI enables you to do is share and work within coalitions, because it allows the transfer of data. Policies and regulations may constrain that. So, for example, security classification, the Americans have something called no foreign, which is no foreign views on it. The British have UK eyes only, and then you have various groupings within Five Eyes communities and others. But processes will need to change to allow better sharing of information and better integration across coalitions. But of course, if you're in NATO with 30 going to 32 members, probably, then that makes any kind of complexity you have at a national level far more so at the international level as well. What the answer to that is, we don't know, but there need to be basic standards. There need to be protocols by which data can be shared, and there probably needs to be a relaxation of some of the rules associated with what can be shared with whom and by when. All of this gives rise to this idea that the military call a whole force, which is a force that includes military and non-military folk, because much of the expertise in AI exists outside the military. A military career structure isn't optimized for bringing in the latest technology and delivering some of that. So the headquarters is going to have to be more diverse. And at the moment, the problem is the military often brings in externals, but only to red team in military sense, but to prove or otherwise what has been said by the military planners. And often the time doesn't exist to change as a consequence of that input. So AI will need to enable us to broaden the organizational system, change who has power in military headquarters, and deliver against that. We think it's going to change how we educate, train, and grow future leaders or commanders. And this perhaps moves us from the kingfisher to the idea of the starlings. Is the military of the future going to be more like the murmuration of starlings, where you've got relatively simple rules, but a diffuse pattern of actors, and the job of the leader is to try to corral or frame the challenge and allow them to act independently, but within that broader ecosystem, hence the eye test on this particular slide. So how you frame questions is going to be a fundamental human challenge of the future. And how do you grow people that can do that, who understand the system well enough to be able to provide the framing into which AI can become a really powerful agent? And the idea of pie-shaped leaders is, if you think of a leader today, they're a classic T shape. You've got a very vertical specialization, and across the top you have the management, and that creates the capital letter T. A lot of thinking in the HR community at the moment is you're going to need pie-shaped leaders, that Greek letter, where you've got two verticals, one of which may well be an understanding of the technology, its capabilities and its limitations, as well as your classic specialization. But we need to move beyond just the commanders and into the whole team, because it is going to diffuse access to this. It's got to go beyond the zealots. And it's going to have to allow access for people who aren't military folk to be groomed and understand the military way of working, as well as military commanders to understand how civilian actors operate, because it's in that dialogue that the special things will happen, where you can frame differently. And Barzilay, professor at MIT, came up with this in the context of antibiotics. They reframed the challenge from looking at new antibiotics to what compounds actually affect or degrade the capacity of E. coli. And they found a completely new range using AI of compounds that would do that, that moved away from the classic antibiotic space into the super drugs that were more E. coli suppressant. People hailed it as a triumph of AI, but the reality was it was a human reframing of the problem that AI was then deployed to deliver that derived the answer. And finally, I'll say on career management, because I know Hugh is going to keep me quiet in a moment. In terms of career management, a system that brings people in at a base rank and then takes 30 to 34 years to grow them to the very top within that one organization is not well suited to the porosity needed to bring in fresh ideas at appropriate levels. So there are some fundamental questions for thinking about how the military grows its organization from being a closed loop into being a much more open or permeable loop, and much more focused on aligning personal management with operational management as well. Because the reality is the military have standing headquarters, they move people every 2 years, so by the time you actually want to deploy that headquarters in wartime, it's probably had a rapid changeover of folk, and they're not the team necessary with the necessary background to allow them to deliver most effectively on that operation. So I haven't spoken much about AI. I've spoken a lot about the organization and the people side, because ultimately AI needs to be more than just enhancing a human process. We need to come up with genuinely human machine processes that deliver the benefits of each and allow each to overcome some of the limitations of the other. And I will pause there, Hugh, pretty much on time, I think.
Outstanding. Christina and Paul, thank you very much indeed. Huge amounts of food for thought there, not least because of the domain in which AI is operating that you are considering. We've had a number of great questions in. Let me start with John Spain, who asks, we had the ethics furore over neutron bombs, obviously with the way they tended to do more damage to people than infrastructure. That will also be raised on military AI if it's not already been done so. What are your thoughts?
Do you want to take this, Christina?
Yeah, happy to. I might have to go off video just because my bandwidth is very weak, but let's see. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we did not elaborate on the ethical dimension. There are, in fact, there's quite a lot of debates around this, and if anything, it's probably the most prominent aspect of AI within the military that all around us right now. We do believe it will remain a fundamental piece, and this is incorporated into what we call the deployment trust. So at any point in time when we use AI, we need to be thinking about what is the use to which we're putting the AI, why do we need to have AI, and of course all the other trust points around it. We'll need to manage this. I think the one point that we didn't address, and I think it's important to underline here, is trust is not absolute. It will never be 100% trust. And there are some fundamental ethical and other issues that will prevent us from fully trusting that technology. Paul?
May I come in and just supplement that? So within the context of the UK, there's been a policy decision made, which is that there will always be a human, quote, in the loop, unquote. So a decision to take a human life will be made by a person, is the policy position. And there is, as Christina said, there's a lot of work being done in the context of ethics. I think for us, in the decision support space, there is a profound ethical question. And Christina alluded to it on the second slide, which was what is meaningful control, because data aren't neutral. The way you present information tells a story. And so AI will be making decisions in how it presents what is, quote, relevant, unquote. I mean, who decides what's relevant in that context, right? So there are some profound questions about decisions that will be made, even for the person who is in the loop, because if AI is presenting that data to them, they can be steered in a particular direction by how that data is being presented. So there are absolutely, in answer to the question, some really quite profound questions that move it away from just a decision to press the button that causes death into actually how much agency does the human have in the future. And we might need to think about calibrating what meaningful human control genuinely means. And if it reassures, there is a piece of work being done in NATO at the moment, which is exploring what meaningful human control means in that context. And I was talking to them a couple of months ago, based on this paper, to say, you can't just leave it as human in the loop and therefore it's fine. There are no ethical questions. There are downstream or upstream questions you ought to consider.
Thank you. Following that great question, we have a really interesting question from James Fleck, who says, in research I conducted with colleagues in innovations in financial services in the 1980s, we found that while military uses drove computational intensity, financial applications were driving voluminous data processing. Do you think that the same is true today?
So I think I would say yes, without obviously having done the kind of research that James alluded to, but it's also very intuitive when we reflect on what we mentioned earlier, that you don't have that volume of data with the military. That part will always exceed on the finance side. But there is a complexity that I think adds probably that computational intensity that you mentioned, because you have a lot more factors to consider at any point in time. But I would not want to venture any further without actually having been involved in any related research.
I think the other point to make is our interlocutors identified that certainly within defence, partly the episodic nature of it, partly the difficulty of establishing lines of causation of actions, but also an acknowledgement that perhaps defence isn't yet as good at the management of the data, very often because there are multiple systems exacerbated by coalition, problems, as I alluded to already, about sharing data. So some of the processes also make it difficult. So the financial services sector, my gut feeling, and we did interview a couple of people in this environment, would be that James is absolutely right. There's still that complexity of processing large amounts of data, but the financial services sector is still ahead, I think, in that ability to deal with some of what it, some of the data, that sense of causation, understanding how quickly a decision or not is validated. So I think short answer, yes.
Thank you. A question from Hugh Purser. How will these AI developments in military infrastructure affect the communication to the public, presumably via politicians and the media?
I think we may have had a problem with Christina, so I will attempt to do that. I wasn't entirely sure what Hugh meant by the military infrastructure in this context, whether he was talking about the sort of the networks themselves, or whether he was talking about a broader understanding of or broader sense of infrastructure.
I think he was talking about if AI is deployed and then therefore resulting command and control decisions are made, how are those then explained, justified, relayed to the public through politicians and the media? You know, is there perhaps some sensitivity to saying, well, computer said yes, so that's what we did?
Yeah, no, thank you. That helps. My first point, I suppose, would be if you wait until that point to explain it, you're too late. And one of the points in the paper is that NATO public engagement needs to be talking, and defence needs to be much more open about what it's doing, what its protocols, what its checks and balances on this actually are. Because if you wait until after something has been destroyed, and then you try to explain it away, then I think you're going to be on the back foot. So there does need to be, I think, a serious attempt to explain what military uses of AI are, particularly in the decision support space, be much clearer about the rules that will govern that, the kind of red lines, if indeed there are those things in place, and where humans play a role in this. And that debate hasn't yet happened. And I think this is part of that broader point about taking it away from the, forgive me again, the term the zealots, but taking it away from those who are at the forefront of thinking about this and putting it into people's minds, and having these kinds of conversations as we're having today, which is really refreshing. So thank you for inviting us again. Because if you wait until you're in war, then it is too late. And let's be honest, I mean, this already operates. I mean, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I was being rocketed and mortared when I was in the military. And the things that were shooting down the rockets and mortars were controlled by machine systems, because the reaction time was so short. By the time the person had processed the information that was incoming, made a decision to press the button, then the thing would have landed on my tent by that stage. So let's be honest about that, have those conversations, and let's find out what people do think that deployment trust Christina was talking about is acceptable and what isn't.
Thank you. And that's a beautiful segue into the next question from Sergei Kuchelenko, who asks, are there already working AI systems of the kind you talk about? Are they in use, and how efficient are they?
There are working AI systems, certainly in the decision support space, and indeed in many areas. AI companies are ahead of the military in this regard. The point that Christina made earlier about the desire for explainable AI limits you in some respects. So military AI in the decision support space, I don't think is at the cutting edge of where technology could take us. And that might be a good thing, depending on your particular perspective about how far you want to automate military processes. The other areas, there are uses of machines making decisions in defensive terms, such as the counter battery fire system. So on a ship, if you've got an incoming missile, there is a machine called a CRAM or a phalanx that will fire a wall of lead at the incoming missile to destroy it. That is machine controlled. It's not part of where our paper was, but that's already out there. And the risk to human life of that is relatively limited. I think the bigger issue for people in the ethical space was not where we went with our paper, but that's this idea of killer robots. And it wasn't something we specifically addressed. And as I say, the policy position in the UK, the US, and elsewhere is this always be a human in the loop. But I think the boundary is being a little bit blurred at times with things like brimstone missiles, that once you fire it and the humans made a decision to fire it, there's an algorithm in the system that will decide of the targets I'm being fired at, this is the one I'm going to go for, because it looks like a tank and the other one looks like a school bus, for example.
Thank you. Robin King asks, how important are the two key elements in relation to each other? That's the change in doctrine and the organization structure and leadership, and the need to advance data literacy and data fluency, so key personnel understand enough of the AI process and the digital outcomes so that they can both be trusted and acted upon.
Indeed, no, thank you. And that's very much where the paper is getting to. And I would add to the question, which is brilliantly phrased, is or mistrusted. Because there are certain circumstances that AI may not be suited to make decisions on. In a human context, of course, it's very easy to say where the enemy has his or her ships and tanks and planes, and it's very easy to say what they have done with them in the last 24 hours, but it's much less easy to impute intention. And AI may help you derive some questions of intention, but it can't always be precise about it. And for example, the French sacked their head of military intelligence because he saw the same kind of information that the US and the British had of the buildup of Russian forces on Ukraine's borders, and decided there wasn't the intent, whereas the British and the Americans had decided there was the intent. And yet the systems were still telling both people the same information. But for us, it was fundamentally a question about the pie-shaped leader that used that data literacy to understand what can and cannot be delivered by AI. It is about doctrine and processes. Arguably, it's always been about doctrine for the military, but there's a brilliant line from Field Marshal Rommel, who was talking about the British and said, the British write some of the best doctrine in the world, it's just as well they never read it. So it's got to be taken out of the doctrine manuals and put into the organization, into the training of individuals, not just as military training, but working alongside civilian counterparts, because if that's the future headquarters structure, you can't wait until you go to war to create the team that's going to fight it. And that's why the career management, the accessibility of training, the thinking about how, if we're going to work with civilian counterparts, do we bring them into our processes in a way that helps them act as agents and not merely checks on things we've already decided we wanted to do.
Well, if I may join here, sorry, apologies. As I feared, my bandwidth failed. So I've been listening, but I didn't want to include. But just to build on this last comment and question, because the risk that we see is fundamental that questions of doctrine organization will be addressed way too late in the process. The technology at this stage is fairly basic so that it doesn't raise those issues. but we may not be surprised if the next innovation in this field comes from an adversary who manages to adapt the organization to maximize the use of AI. And this is where ultimately it's not going to be how good the technology is, but how well adapted is going to be the organization, the structures, the underpinning doctrine in using it, which is exactly what Napoleon did. The concept of a division in itself was not new, but he really translated it into a real strength, and he created a fighting force that was really organized and structured to deliver the effect. So these are the questions that are not being asked, and doctrine by definition lags behind whenever you have new innovations, particularly technology driven. And the risk that we might see down the road is because you haven't developed the institutional construct, because you haven't developed the human cognitive part to be able to be that constructive critic and teammate to the AI, you may end up with not so much with mistrust, but overtrust. Right? The technology, we just rely on technology way too much, and we haven't really adapted the human institutional aspects around it.
Thank you very much. And Richard Priest pretty much picks up the theme and pushes on and says the military are used to applying principles doctrine to apply to context. Are you developing principles for the framing of questions for AI to answer that will then feed into decision making?
I mean, this is to a large extent what we hope people currently in the military and senior decision makers are doing or will reflect on as a response to this paper. There is actually, institutions within the military like the Concepts and Development Center whose role is precisely that. But as we mentioned, this is very much in the early stages precisely because the use of AI is still fairly nascent or the uses are fairly benign. So that debate hasn't really taken root.
Thank you. Mark Cook makes a related point as well. He said, thanks, fascinating chat. We called it augmented intelligence, especially in medical environments, as the human is ultimately making the decision and the AI presenting probability of answers. Do you see that analogy as applicable here?
Very much.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, thanks, Christina. No, very much so. I would absolutely agree with you in that, Mark, that the conversations we've had within the military see it as this human machine team. So let's bring the two elements together rather than seek purely a replacement of one party with another. And AI is very good at processing vast quantities of data. It can do so far more quickly than humans. But at the moment, the view is it's still feeding a human. The levels of processing, of course, will be different over time. But there's a line that talks about the nature and the character of conflict. So the character of conflict changes with technology, but the nature of it remains the same. It's very visceral, it's human, it's about affecting an adversary. And AI is part of the character, not the nature of that warfare at this stage. So augmented intelligence is a great way of putting it, I think, Mark. Thank you.
The one thing that I would add here is that even though there is significant complexity and some of the same time pressure, I guess, that you would have in a medical context, it is still to some extent a controlled environment. There are only so many variables that could go wrong. And the knowledge, I guess, of those variables is more extensive. I think in an active military environment and conflict, you will not have that controlling element. I think it will always be harder for the human in the loop, so to speak, to manage all of those different inputs and make a decision. And that's not to be underestimated. That will always be quite different in the military context.
And to round off with one last question, again from Hugh Purser, and a really pertinent question. How do you deal with the question that the good guys will be influenced by ethics, where the bad guys won't?
I think that's that's always one of the risks, and it brings into that ethical point of, do you want to become your enemy, which arguably is one of the reasons that you're against them, is because you believe that your way of life, your value system is worth defending. And do you defend that by sacrificing it? So it becomes perhaps too convenient an excuse, but it's knowing what is important to you and why you might be fighting. But it's not just, of course, about fighting, it's also about competing. And fighting is the extreme end of that competition, but there are other things to be done beforehand. And ultimately, I think that the question for the West to grapple with is, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to preserve the thing that you regard as important? And if you have to sacrifice what is most important to you, then you've lost already.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is this is why we can't close our eyes to the implications of an accelerated use of AI, because it will happen. And what we don't want to face is a situation where we're just reacting to adversaries having gained the primary advantage in the space. Because once AI is seriously used in the battlefield, the other side will do the same. So we need to start thinking now about how we develop our future human talent and future military leaders, and how do we adapt our institutions so we still maintain those ethical rules that we consider very important.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating exploration of a theme, I think, that is going to continue to grow and develop in importance, not least because we have an active and live war in the European theatre. So I would like again to thank our sponsors for making it possible that we can hold these extremely interesting sessions. I would like to thank the audience from around the world for joining in. I will point to you towards further sessions of similarly interesting nature that are coming up shortly. Tomorrow and next week, the series of webinars continues to roll, which is outstanding. And then to thank Christina and Paul for taking us through an exceptionally interesting exploration of this critically important subject. What a very, very interesting topic. And both of you, thank you so much. I do commend Christina and Paul's paper as well that explores this in even more depth. Thank you and good day to everyone.
Thank you very much, Jim.